All right, so welcome back. We are looking at Matthew chapter 24, verse 1. And that is, we're going to look at a prophecy that Jesus makes towards the end of his earthly ministry. And it's going to line up with Daniel's prophecy in Daniel chapter 9. Jesus makes this prophecy after, you see in verse 1 and verse 2, he and his disciples, they leave the temple in Jerusalem, and he tells them in verse 2 that there shall not be left here one stone upon another, and that shall not be thrown down. And so he is talking about a future and complete destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Now, many folks who are replacement theology and also called, I believe, preterists. They believe that this was fulfilled, what Jesus is going to talk about here in Matthew chapter 24, was fulfilled literally already in 70 AD, when the Romans came in, wiped out the city, toppled the walls of Jerusalem. But I think what you're going to see as we go through Matthew 24, if you're going to look at this literally, there's no way that it could have been fulfilled in 70 AD. So he's in verse 3, Jesus takes them to the Mount of Olives. They sit down, and the disciples begin asking him, saying, "Tell us when these things shall be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world." So they ask him a number of questions, the last of which dealing with the end, not so much, I believe that's not world. I don't believe that is cosmos, the end of the world system, but it's actually ion, which is age. So they're asking about the end of the age. And he says here in verse 4, Jesus answers them and said unto them, "Take heed that no man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass. But the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in divers places. All these are the beginning of sorrows." So in verses 4 through 8, I believe if we were to take out or look and do parallel between the first couple chapters in Revelation, well, not the first couple, but from Revelation chapter 4 and those first couple, these would line up with the judgments at the beginning of the tribulation. These wars, these civil wars, that there is famine in the lands, that there are earthquakes, that there are all kinds of things that are going on. But he says that these are the beginning of sorrows. Those first 3.5 years of the tribulation, it's like that snowball on top of the hill that just starts rolling and just begins picking up steam. But we see here in verse 9, something changes, right? He states there, then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. And then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. And many false prophets shall rise and deceive many. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. But he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. There's a lot of folks who I think take this passage out of context, and they try to apply it to what's going on in the church age right now. A lot of people will take this verse in verse 14, stating that Christ is not going to come back until the gospel of Jesus Christ is preached. They actually would say that the rapture is not going to happen until the gospel is preached all over the world. But he's talking about this time period of the tribulation, that he was going to provide evangelists. He's going to provide individuals that would go all over the world preaching the gospel, the necessary promises for salvation during this 7-year time period.
It's going to be them 144,000 Jews, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Then he states here, and look what Jesus says in verse 15. When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place. Whoso readeth, let him understand. Right? So he's stating that, now remember, Daniel's prophecy was a near and far prophecy. Antiochus Epiphanes, his sacrilegious blasphemy in the temple occurred about 300 years before Jesus was born. And yet Jesus is saying, look forward to this, right? He says, when ye shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, he says, then, verse 16, let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. So Jesus was prophesying of another one, right? Antiochus Epiphanes was only a type. He was only an image of the greater abomination of desolation that would occur in a rebuilt temple in Jerusalem, or that will occur in a rebuilt temple in Jerusalem. Verse 16, let them flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. Neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. But pray ye that your flight not be in winter, neither on the Sabbath day. So this is what he's talking about here, is that when this occurs in the future, when the Antichrist does this at the halfway mark, right? When he violates the peace treaty with the nation of Israel, and they see that he does this in the temple, that was the red flag to be like, get out and get out now. And the reason being is what he says here in verse 21. For then, right? When the Antichrist breaks the treaty at the 3.5 year mark, when this abomination of desolation, then there shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. Jesus is stating the last 3.5 years of the tribulation, this last of the 7 years of God's judgment on Israel. He said things are just going to blow up exponentially. Okay.
Is that when Satan was released?
Well, we're gonna see that in a second.
Oh.
So we'll answer that question in just 1 minute. Verse 22, he says, and except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. Essentially saying, if it went longer than the 7-year time period that Daniel prophesied, no one would have survived. Right? It is that bad. So we see him prophesying about this great tribulation that would occur. But as you mentioned, as we looked at here, if we go back to verse 8 and verse 9, right? He talks about kingdoms rising against kingdoms and pestilences, famines and earthquakes, right? But during those first 3.5 years, Israel is at relative peace because of the arrangement that they had agreed with the Antichrist to provide them that protection. But something changes, right? And I think this would have been this really goes well with the angelology class, right? Because there's something that happens in the spirit realm that people wouldn't be able to see. That is the impetus behind this change at the 3.5 year mark. So let's go ahead and turn to Revelation chapter 12.
Hey, Dan.
Yes.
Real quick on check verse 9.
Mm-hmm.
When he says, "You shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake," are these the saved Jews and the saved Gentiles they're talking about? Are they wiped out, or is this just the saved Jews?
I think God's going to use all kinds of means to wipe out the 2/3. And so, just because someone is a Jew, they're going to die by all kinds of things. I think
But you're going to have saved Gentiles and saved Jews. Were they the ones that Christ says you're going to be hated for my name's sake?
I think all Jews.
Well, what about Gentiles that are saved?
You could,
There's going to be saved Gentiles that get saved during this 3.5 years, aren't there?
They'll be hated too.
right, they will be.
Beheaded, a whole bunch of them. But
Yeah, I don't think it'll be. Percentage-wise, I think it'll be a very low percentage, and we're actually going to look at that. the next judgment here, the judgment of the sheep and goats.
Okay.
But yes, Gentiles could lose their lives for not taking the mark of the beast or for helping a Jew during this time period.
When he says for my name's sake, I assume it means Christian.
No, he's actually
Verse 9.
he's referring here to the nation of Israel. These are
Okay.
questions that Jews are asking him about the Jews.
All right,
And
go ahead.
so he is telling them what's going to happen to that nation. So I think that hatred is just directed whether the Jew is saved or not. A Jew is a Jew is a Jew, and they're going to be wiping Jews out. The Antichrist's forces, they're going to be looking to take them all out. So while this is going on, or right before this happens, Art, there's something that happens in the spirit realm. And we see that in Revelation chapter 12. Now, we'll do a little bit of a workup here, beginning in verse 1. And John is going to give us he's going to use some figurative language, but he's going to give us a history of God's people. Beginning in verse 1. And he says, "And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And she, being with child, cried, travailing in birth and pain to be delivered." So this is, the woman here is a reference to the nation of Israel. Okay. Verse 3, it says, "And there appeared another wonder in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns upon his heads. And his tail drew the third part of the stars of heaven." If you remember, as Steve mentioned in the Old Testament, the stars were the place, inhabitants of where the angels inhabited. So he's referring to this great red dragon being Satan himself. We see that in another passage in Revelation. He got a third of the angels in heaven to be on his side. And it says, "And he did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, which is ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born." And so the child born of the nation of Israel would be a reference to Christ. And you think about how Satan moved Herod, and these individuals try to kill Christ right after he was born. Verse 5, it says, "And she brought forth a man-child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron." So this child that was born would eventually rule all the nations with a rod of iron. We go back to the prophecies in the Psalms that talk about how Christ is going to rule in that fashion. And it says her child was caught up unto God and to his throne. So that would be the resurrection, right? And the ascension. Verse 6, "And the woman fled into the wilderness." And we're going to see here in just a little bit what he's referring to here. But in verse 6, he's referring to when the abomination of desolation occurs at the 3.5-year mark, that the nation of Israel will flee into the wilderness. Remember what Jesus said? When you see the abomination of desolation, run for the hills, right? This would have been the Judean wilderness in the direction of Jordan, right? These caves and these coves and these hidden nooks and crannies east of Israel. It says she's going to flee into the wilderness where she hath a place prepared of God or by God, that they should feed here for 1,260 days. Guess how long 1,260 days are? 3.5 years. And so God has a place out in this Judean wilderness, likely somewhere between Israel and Jordan, in this wasteland, wilderness area, in which the nation of Israel will be hiding from Antichrist and Antichrist's forces. All right, so it's not a great chronology, right? John doesn't do it in great chronological fashion, but here in verse 7 he says this. So this is going on simultaneous, right? And he says, "There was a war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels, and prevailed not, neither was their place found any more in heaven. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him." Then we see in verse 10, "And heard a loud voice saying in heaven, Now is come salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ. For the accuser of our brethren is cast down, which accused them before our God day and night. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb. Let's drop down to verse 13. And he states, and when the dragon saw that he was cast unto the earth, he persecuted the woman, who is Israel, which brought forth the man-child. And the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place, where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time from the face of the serpent. And the serpent cast out of his mouth water as a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away of the flood. And the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon cast out of his mouth. And the dragon was wroth with the woman, or the dragon was wroth with Israel, and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. So let's tie in everything we've been learning about in the spirit being class, if you will, right? We know now, presently, Satan has access to heaven, right? It was really that way since the beginning of time. We go back to the book of Job, and where Satan presented himself before God, right? And all these spirit beings. It's not until midway through the tribulation where we see that Satan tries to, once again, storm God's throne, where Satan is cast out of heaven, and now he no longer has access to heaven. It says that he was cast down to earth. And when he realizes it, he no longer has access to heaven, right? He knows his time is short. And so what does he say? I'm going to take Israel down with me. And so he pours out all of his wrath and his vengeance on the nation of Israel, trying to wipe them out, try to basically stop God's plan from coming to completion. So we know that the Antichrist he's been given his authority and his power by Satan himself. So Satan is going to move the Antichrist to try to completely wipe out the nation of Israel. And that's when you have this abomination of desolation and Israel fleeing into the wilderness, and the Antichrist and his forces pursuing Israel into the wilderness, trying to wipe them out. But we see here that God, that it says here in verse 12, verse 15, the serpent cast out of his mouth water as a flood after the woman. This could be literal. A lot of Bible commentators believe that this could be just a reference to Satan's forces, or the Antichrist's forces pursuing them, and that it says that the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed up the flood. So it would be kind of similar to how the Red Sea, God used the Red Sea to wipe out Pharaoh's forces. This may be a reference to some kind of an earthquake or something seismic or supernatural that occurs to wipe out Antichrist's forces. So after that, it appears that he redirects his attention away from the Jews that fled into the wilderness towards possibly in verse 17, when he says the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. This could be a reference to the 144,000 Jewish evangelists that are going across the globe. And so it appears that may be the case for the remaining 3.5 years after he's not able to wipe them out in the wilderness. He goes after these guys. So
those that fled into the wilderness and were preserved for 3.5 years must have just been the remnant, the 1/3 of the Jews.
We don't know. Because you think about it, the Hebrew people were brought through the Red Sea and into the wilderness, right? Before they entered in the Promised Land. But while they were there, a vast majority of them they died off. So we don't have all the details, but I'm thinking that in that 3.5 year time period when a large, and I don't think it's every Jewish person, because there's possibly some Jews still scattered across the globe. There may be some that don't heed, right? There may be some that don't listen to this warning, right? And they die in Jerusalem because they don't leave. And there may be some unbelieving ones that go into the wilderness and die off during those 3.5 years. So, or maybe as they're fleeing. So there's probably, but at the end of those 3.5 years, all that's left is the third. So once God brings the nation into the wilderness, we see that he pleads with the nation. We see this in Ezekiel chapter 20, verses 33 through 38. But when we think of the word plead, that's not exactly what the Hebrew word means. So he's not begging, right? Come back to me, Israel. Come back to me, right? I love you. I love you. It actually means something different. But let's read these verses first. He says, "As I live, saith the Lord God, surely with a mighty hand and with a stretched out arm and with fury poured out, I will rule over you. And I will bring you out from the people and will gather you out of the countries wherein ye are scattered. And with a mighty hand and with a stretched out arm and with fury poured out. And I will bring you into the wilderness of the people. And there will I plead with you face to face. Like as I pleaded with your fathers in the wilderness of the land of Egypt, so will I plead with you, saith the Lord God. And I will cause you to pass under the rod, and I will bring you into the bond of the covenant. And I will purge out from among you the rebels and them that transgress against me. And I will bring them forth out of the country where they sojourn, and they shall not enter into the land of Israel. And ye shall know that I am the Lord." So once again, we see that this is a period of judgment. This purging of rebels, unbelieving Jews from amongst the nation. And that word plead, the Hebrew word translated plead, actually has the idea of to make a judgment, to pronounce a judgment. It's not a begging. It's not an asking. This is similar to, he used the similar comparison to what God did in the wilderness. He didn't plead with the unbelieving Jews, right? Believe me, believe me, believe me. No, what did he do? You don't believe me? Okay, here's fiery serpents. You don't believe me? Okay, here's an earthquake. You don't believe me? Right? And so it was a time of judgment on unbelieving Jews, right? To purify them, so it would be a believing remnant that would enter into the promised land. So we see that, oh man, I'm gushing. 2/3 of the Jews will die during this time period. As it stated in there, we don't know all the ways that they're going to die, but it will be part of this purification process. Verse 38, he uses the word pure, and that literally, definition of that is to separate that which is impure or drossy, to make clean, pure, clear, and bright by washing, rubbing, or polishing. So what God is doing during this time period, at the end of human history, is he's judging his elect people. And he's judging them to bring through this believing third, this remnant. And look what Paul says here. We'll stop here in chapter 9, verse 6 through 8, talking about how he says, "Not as though the word of God hath taken none effect, for they are not all Israel which are of Israel." He's saying not every Jew is true Israel. God counts true Israelis as those that believe on him. Look what he says in verse 7. "Neither because they are the seed of Abraham are they all children, but in Isaac thy seed shall be called." Remember, Isaac was the son of promise. Ishmael was the son of the flesh. Right? Isaac is representative of believing Jews, those that live by faith. Verse 8, "That is, they which are of the children of the flesh, these are not the children of God, but the children of the promise are counted for the seed." So to just kind of tie up the loose ends, the tribulation or this judgment on the nation of Israel will be a 7-year time period. It's still future. God is not done dealing with the nation of Israel yet. But when he begins his dealings with them again, they're not going to get off on a good foot. It's going to be their correction, chastisement, punishment is necessary in order to sift out those that are true believers so that they can be recipients of the new covenant that God had promised Israel in Jeremiah when he says that I will put my law in your hearts. And these will be the spiritual requirements for those that will enter into the millennial kingdom. This kingdom that God had promised to Abraham, to David, as a part of this, and that they will be able to enjoy these millennial promises. All right, let me take a break real quick and then we'll get started with the judgment of the sheep and the goats. So the third judgment we're going to look at is the judgment of the Gentiles. So we looked at the church's judgment, we looked at Israel's judgment, and then this here would be what we would consider the judgment of the Gentiles at the end of the tribulation. I was kind of hoping Pastor and Lisa would be here tonight to ask them if they've been to this garden. There's a garden on a hill in Jerusalem, and it's part of this complex. I'm going to say it wrong. Yad Vashem. I think it's Yad Vashem. It is the organization that does for the nation of Israel that commemorates the Holocaust. And so there is this complex on this hillside in Jerusalem that is a memorial to the Holocaust. But in that complex, there's a smaller garden, and it's the garden of the righteous, dedicated to the righteous among the nations. And the righteous among the nations is a reference to the non-Jews, right, the Gentiles during World War II that risked their lives to save Jews. You may have heard, the movie Schindler's List, right? Oskar Schindler, or you may have heard of some famous people. Raoul Wallenberg I believe he was a Swedish diplomat that was responsible for getting thousands of visas for Jewish people to get out of Europe and flee the Nazis. I actually have a book just entitled The Righteous. It's like this thick, and it is historical accounts of Gentiles in almost every European country that they have evidence that these individuals helped Jews. Some of them were religious, some were Catholic priests, some were diplomats, various countries' diplomats. Some were businessmen like Oskar Schindler, farmers, teachers, even gypsies. All right, just from all walks of life, there were individuals that stood up against the Nazis and were willing to risk their lives to protect Jewish people during this Holocaust. In Matthew chapter 25, we see a reference to Jesus stating that there is going to be a future judgment on the Gentiles for those that make it through the tribulation. I think it was Art, you mentioned about the many, many Gentiles that would die during this time period. And it's going to be a staggering number. But there are going to be some that make it through those 7 years. And what we're going to see is that there is a judgment of the Gentiles that make it through. They will be judged by Christ when he returns. And he's going to separate them based upon how they treated the Jewish people during those 7 years. All right, and so that is what's considered the judgment of the sheep and goats. We have in our notes here, letter A, it states the judgment of the sheep and the goats is often used to establish the social justice by which the church is supposed to operate, feeding the poor of mankind, visiting the sick, also visiting those in prison. Many ministries operate today upon the basis of the premise that this scripture identifies the church's marching orders in this dispensation. So let's go ahead and turn to Matthew chapter 25, because that's where we're going to see this. It probably rings a bell. You've probably heard it taught on. Hopefully you've heard it taught on accurately. But Jesus is prophesying a future time when he is going to gather all the nations. And this will be a reference to the Gentiles. We see that in verse 32. The word translated Gentile or nations, it's the same Greek word. It just depends on however the translators feel it's best to represent it at that time. But essentially, the Gentiles and nations are synonymous. And he says, and he shall separate them one from another as a shepherd divideth his sheep from the goats. And he shall set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on the left. Then shall the king say unto them on his right hand, Come, ye blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. So there will be a group of these individuals from among the nations that are blessed by Christ when he returns. And the basis for that blessing, he says, when I was hungered, you gave me meat. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. I was a stranger, you took me in. Naked, you clothed me. I was sick, you visited me. I was in prison, and you came unto me. And the righteous answer him, Lord, when saw we thee hungered and fed thee, or thirsty and gave thee drink? And then so on and so forth. And verse 40, and it says, And the king shall answer and say unto them, Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me. We are big here on studying God's word literally, but this is often allegorized or spiritualized and an application is made for the church today. And basically stating that the nations will be blessed by Christ, but we got to do all kinds of social justice programs. We got to go into the prisons and help these people. We need to feed the homeless. We need to eradicate poverty. We need to do all that's what Christ's blessings on us will be about. But I think if you understand Matthew 24 and 25 as dealing with the tribulation time period, it'll begin to make a little bit more sense. So if we go back to verse 31, we see here that this judgment of the sheep and goats will occur when the Son of Man comes in his glory. This is going to occur. Christ is going to return in his glory at the end of the tribulation. Right? We have in Revelation that Christ is going to come back. He is going to make himself known when he wipes out the enemies of Israel as they have amassed themselves trying to wipe out Israel at the end of those 7 years. This was not something that was true of him when he was on earth. Right? We know in Philippians, we know in Hebrews and Philippians, right? He took on flesh and blood. He essentially set aside his glory or veiled his glory, all right, his divine glory when he took on a human nature and took on the form of a servant, right? When people saw Jesus walking on earth, they saw a carpenter with calloused hands, wearing sandals and a beard. They did not see his divine glory. There was not glow. There was not a halo. He was not levitating off of the ground, except in the few instances when he did miracles, right? When he was operating in his divine nature. Then, of course, you have the Mount of Transfiguration for a brief time period where he unveiled to just 3 of his disciples, right? Peter, James, and John, what his divine glory was like. But that was just a snippet. But we do have promises in Jesus states in John chapter 17, verse 5, in the upper room when he's praying to the Father, and he says, Father, I want to return to the glory that I shared with you right before I left heaven. And so at his ascension, right, he returns to the glory, his divine glory that he deserves. But that is veiled to our eyes until he returns back. And that return is going to happen at the end of the tribulation. We see that here in Matthew chapter 24. So go ahead and turn back just that one chapter. Matthew chapter 24, verse 29 and verse 30. Once again, Matthew chapter 24, the context is the time period of the tribulation. And he states in verse 29, Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the 4 winds, from the one end of heaven to the other. So when Jesus came the first time, it was without any kind of fanfare, right? He was in the podunk town of, he was from Nazareth, right? And they were, in this little manger, there was no audience, right? There was no fanfare. There were no bright lights. Hardly anybody knew about it. But when he comes again, right? When he comes at the end of the tribulation, everyone will know. And he's going to come in his power. He's going to come in his glory. And so this is what is being referred to here when he returns. So we see, we'll look at letter C. The time frame of the sheep and goats judgment is established by the fact that the Son is sitting upon his throne. So we go back to Matthew chapter 25, verse 31, and it says that when the Son of Man shall come in his glory, right, so the end of the tribulation, and all the holy angels with him, then shall he sit upon the throne of his glory. Now, has anybody ever heard the song Soon and Very Soon? We're going to see the King soon and very soon. I love that song, but nowhere in Scripture do you see that Jesus is the church's king. He's the head of the church, right? We are his bride, but his kingly relationship is with the nation of Israel. And so when we see him sitting on his throne as king, this is a reference to his relationship as the ruler of Israel, right? When he is going to and really rule the earth during this millennial kingdom. And this is what we see in Luke chapter 1, verse 32. This is a fulfillment of the promises to David, that someone from David's line would have the authority to sit upon his throne, right, for all of eternity. That is a reference to Christ. And so we see this is a time period, verse 34. He is referred to as the king, right? Once again, he is going to rule the earth with a rod of iron. We see that established in prophecies and Psalms. And so in verse 34, he is referred to as the king. This was how Christ offered himself to the nation of Israel when he came in the Gospels. The Jews didn't want him, right? We have no king but Caesar, is what they told Pontius Pilate. Crucify him. Crucify him. So they rejected him as king, but he will return to take his rightful throne. And so when he returns to take his rightful throne, and he has brought the third of the nation of Israel through, he's also going to have a time period in which he judges the Gentiles that are still alive. Verse 32, it says, "And before him shall be gathered all nations." It's interesting that word gathered is actually in the passive voice. So the nations won't be gathering themselves. Someone else will be doing the gathering. Christ will somehow be bringing them in, right? As you can imagine, many of the Gentiles who probably treated the Jews poorly during this time period will not be very excited about coming before Christ. You think about the Nazis, right? At the end of World War II, where many of them did not want to stick around in Germany, did they? Especially the commandants of the Holocaust chambers and camps. Those guys were in Argentina, they're in Bolivia, right? They in Saudi, they're in the Middle East. They were getting out of Dodge. And so somehow Jesus is, this is utilizing the angels, whatnot, but the nations will be brought to him for this time period of judgment.
Yeah. Just trying to visualize this picture. So going at the beginning of the millennium, those who have survived the tribulation, the evil ones have been judged. And Jesus establishes his kingdom. The surviving Israelites came out of the place where they were protected. Mm-hmm. The surviving Gentiles were still all places around the world, right, wherever their nations were. They had some survivors from each of those nations in their place where they lived.
Right.
Am I seeing this right?
No, you got it. That's how I understand.
That's where they're gathered from, is all around the world, wherever they are now. That's where they were living and managed to survive the tribulation.
Correct. That's how I understand it. Mm-hmm. And it's likely that the Jews that these Gentiles helped were likely the 144,000 evangelists that were traveling all over the world.
Right. They're the ones that traveled the world to evangelize, right?
Right. And if you remember, go ahead.
Well, I was just, again, the numbers. If you use the numbers that you used in the beginning of of this evening, there's about 15 million Jews, and if it's something like that or a little bit more by the time this all happens, there's only going to be about 5 million Jews.
Yeah, but you got 1,000 years because they're.
We're not into that yet.
But yeah, this is all this. All this precedes entrance into the kingdom.
But the numbers of Gentile believers starting at the millennium is going to be much greater than that.
Because I think 3/4 are wiped out of the world.
Well, I don't know about how many were wiped out, but the amount that
half
survived.
One plague and 1/4 of the other.
Well, okay, so not everybody who survives is going to be a believer. Not every Gentile that survives the 7 years of tribulation are actually going to be believers.
Oh.
Because that's what this judgment is about. There are some that survive that showed no interest in the Jewish people, that didn't care for them, and that's where this separation is.
That's the goats.
So the sheep would be a reference to. Look what he says here in verse 32. So before him shall be gathered all nations, and he shall separate them one from another, as a shepherd divideth his sheep from the goats. And he shall set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on the left. And we'll summarize this, but he says to the sheep, you are the blessed of my Father. And the reason he says you're blessed of my Father and you can have entrance into the kingdom is because you gave me drink when I was thirsty, and you went into prison and you cared for me, right? You clothed me when I was naked. And they said, when did we do that? And he said, when you did it even to the least of one of my brethren. But then he says to the goats, but you will be cast into essentially eternal destruction, right?
What verse are we in now?
So, yeah,
Some
40.
of these goats be the one that took the mark of the beast and that survived.
The one that took the mark of the beast is destroyed.
I mean, they're already goats.
But not all Gentiles took the mark of the beast. And I don't necessarily think that everybody who took the mark of the beast is destroyed. I think there's still, it appears that there's still some. Because he says here in verse 41, then shall he say unto them on the left hand, so these would be the goats, depart from me, ye cursed, into everlasting fire prepared for the devil and his angels. He says, I was hungry, you didn't feed me. I was thirsty, you didn't give me any drink. I was naked, you didn't clothe me. And then they say in verse 44, but when did that happen? Right? And he says, verse 45, verily I say unto you, inasmuch as ye did it not to one of the least of these, ye did it not to me. And these shall go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into life eternal. So there is we don't have numbers, we don't have percentages, but there is a population of Gentiles that make it through the 7-year time period of tribulation. And I believe we have passages in Revelation that point to the fact that there are some believing Gentiles that are killed as a result of their faith, right? That maybe they believe the message of the evangelists, they're killed or whatnot, but there are still some that make it through.
Okay.
And
so this is just the last stage of the judgment of the unbelievers.
Yes.
Because from that point on, there's no unbelievers until they're born into the millennium.
Correct. Yes. So all the unbelieving Gentiles will be cast into everlasting punishment, and only believing Gentiles will be allowed entrance with the believing Jews into the millennial kingdom.
Right. Okay.
And it comes down to the criteria that they're being judged by is whether or not they assisted Jesus' brethren, Jewish brethren, during the tribulation.
Interesting. Can you say anything about whether or not they believe?
Well, so here's the question, right? And so I'm glad that you bring that up, because the question is this work salvation? right? Are we stating that there's a work salvation? But I think James is very helpful when it comes to faith, right? Justifying before men. What does James say? Without faith, or without works, faith is dead. It's not existent. And he uses illustrations of Abraham and Rahab, right? And what did Rahab do? She was a Gentile, right? And what did she do? She protected the spies. But she wasn't saved because of that. That was an act of faith based upon it, because she went on and basically she said, I rescued you because I saw what your God did to these other nations, and I believe that he is the one true God. She believed. And so what I believe what the criteria here is, it's a demonstration of their faith that Israel's God, he is the one true God, right? And so they were willing to risk their lives for the Jews based upon their faith. So I don't think we see a work salvation here. I think he's basically stating that you demonstrated what you believed by helping my Jewish brethren during this time period.
There was a confession of Christ. They just, like Abraham, they believed God was God.
Yeah, I think there is a different gospel.
There was no Holy Spirit in their being like we have.
Yeah, I think there's a different gospel during the tribulation for someone to be saved.
We don't know what the 144,000 were preaching.
We don't. It says it's the gospel of the kingdom.
Yeah.
And it could be something almost like the effect of what John the Baptist was preaching about, hey, the kingdom of heaven, right? Believe the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And so it may be something comparable to that, but we don't know exactly.
But it still has to be some element of Christ being the focal point of it.
Right, and maybe it's, the king is coming, right?
Yeah.
The king is coming. You believe that the king is coming and align yourself with that. But anyway, so that kind of, that cleans everything up. So now we can have that entrance into the millennial kingdom. Where actually God's promise to Abraham would actually, Gentiles can benefit from that as well. And so that is the judgment of the sheep and the goats. Okay. So I'm glad you stopped me on that and you asked me, because I felt like I wasn't really explaining that very well.
Well, this is the first time that I've been taught that this passage is talking about judgment of unbelieving Gentiles that's surviving the tribulation, because I've always thought they didn't make it. None of them made it that weren't saved already. Mm-hmm. But they made some that, I see that now, that some did actually make it, but they didn't survive it. Judgment.
Right, yeah, they don't get it through.
They don't last very long.
Right. Now we have one more judgment to cover, and that's the great white throne judgment, and that's what is referred to as the second death. All right, so this is when all those in hell are judged according to their works, and every single person is found wanting, right? And so there is no judgment of any believer at the great white throne, but this is called the second judgment, or second death, and where hell is thrown into this eternal lake of fire. And that occurs at the end of the millennial kingdom, and then that will usher in eternity, right? So we'll look at that great white throne of judgment next week, and then we'll start looking at the future of the church, Israel, and the future of the Gentiles. All right. Cool. Well, thanks for coming out.